Xi Jinping has unveiled China's top leadership, the 6 new members on the Politburo Standing Committee, the equivalent of China's cabinet. All are Xi loyalists, meaning there is now no opposition at the top. Here we can see Xi Jinping followed by Shanghai party chief Li Qiang, which means Li is likely to become premier, replacing Li Qiang in March. So, is Xi Jinping now unstoppable? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Huang Kwei-bo, National Chengchi University Associate Professor of Diplomacy and its former Vice Dean of the College of International Affairs and former Chairman at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Research and Planning Committee, and Raymond Sung, Taiwan New Constitution Foundation Deputy CEO. And from the US, I spoke to commentator and China expert Gordon Chang, who is also a distinguished senior fellow at Gatehouse Institute and author of The Great US-China Tech War and the Coming Collapse of China. And from Bangkok, I spoke to Michael Sheridan, author of The Gate to China. He was Asia correspondent for the Sunday Times London for 20 years, covering the rise of China. Professor Sung, how powerful is Xi Jinping now?
Oh, right. I think the selection of his cabinet member or the membership of the Politburo under Xi Jinping for his third term is quite remarkable. It tells us and tells the world how much the power is concentrated on the hand of one man, which is Xi Jinping himself. We all know that the CCP has always been, the power of has always been concentrated on the hand of the General Secretary of the party. But we have never seen that we can go without the party division or a more general sharing of powers between fractions. And we all see now the Politburo are all the cronies or the people who Xi Jinping can trust. And I believe that's personally selected by Xi Jinping himself. And the second point is that the background of all those members are also noteworthy. For example, Li Qiang. Li Qiang was served as a secretary to Xi Jinping when Xi Jinping is doing his job in Zhejiang. So meaning that Li Qiang is not a technocrat or bureau officer himself, but a personal secretary to his leaders. And also that Li Qiang was later served as a party secretary to Shanghai, the biggest city, and he directed the lockdown of the Shanghai city to enforce Xi Jinping's zero tolerance on COVID. So he's a loyalist to Xi Jinping and this was the people.
This was also unpopular within the party itself.
Not just the need or the economic need or the people's living. So it shows the style of the governance of Xi, and now he has his total control of his right and left hand, so he can more enforce his policies more throughout, more thoroughly. And also Cai Qi. Cai Qi was the secretary for the Beijing city, and he directed the removal of the marginal peoples and the people on the street, and also enforcement of party policy without regard to the actual need of the people's living. So it shows that Xi Jinping is doing his job and to select his own people, his cronies, on the basis of the people who can trust, rather than on their expertise or their capability, which is very, very noteworthy.
So this is actually about personal loyalty to Xi, yes, as opposed to the merits of this person's expertise or experience. Professor Huang, let me bring you in. Do you think that Xi Jinping is taking China back to the Mao era?
The Mao era was a disaster to China. And I personally do not think Xi is going to take China back to that kind of era. But of course, Xi, I think, admires some of the Mao's thoughts. And he thought the party and the government should be above the society. And Xi is clear to say that he would like to pursue some consolidated party control state system. That is why, there is a harder control of the CCP over the overall Chinese civil society. And I think that's the way she would like to try to have a sort of new government societal system that is being tested in China under the principles of communism with Chinese characteristics. I don't know whether or not he will be successful, but I think that would be a big try in human history.
You mentioned a consolidation in state control. How do you characterize the consolidation of Xi Jinping's own power? I think it went even further than what people had expected. Is that correct? I think people had talked about maybe two positions on the Standing Committee being removed. And actually, he's gone for all four of new faces, plus the two previous members who were also loyal to Xi. Do you think it's gone further than what people expected?
I think that Xi's consolidation of power has been very obvious by removing some old members, Politburo members out. But I think in general, Xi Jinping would like to have a stronger grasp of this Politburo and the party structure so that he can do something he really wants to. And it's important to note that Xi Jinping's consolidation power may not be something unacceptable in the society of China, because I think right now the people on mainland China still look for some greater economic prosperity, stronger national defense, and of course, the pride of China on world stages. So if Xi Jinping can be successful in doing that, then I think his consolidation of power like this time will be less troublesome for most of the people in China. But however, if he fails, then I think he will be in big trouble.
Raymond Sung, the reason why I talked about Mao is because Deng Xiaoping, after him, brought in collective leadership, wanted to rule out personality cults, this sort of thing. So what do you feel? Do you feel that Xi Jinping is regressing China?
I think that the science shows, and it always shows themselves. I mention several aspects. Firstly, that this time the selection of the Politburo members has broken all the rules set up by the Deng Xiaoping, which is wise, and he's tailored to the need for China after the 1970s, when China needs to grow and China needs to establish itself as a major powerhouse for the global economy. And for that, China has to keep a lower profile on the world stage and not to blast for the competition, for the hegemony for the world. But all those rules, for example, the successor rules and the division of powers and collective leadership has all broken by Xi Jinping this time. And there's no successor, clear successor after Xi Jinping. And we now believe that Xi will serve until his death or until he feels safe to step down. And for that, it's really the governing style of the CCP now is back to Mao's style. And also the word used by Xi Jinping about struggle to win for the greater dream of the Chinese people on the world stage, to struggle with the foreign interference on Taiwan issue, for example. All those are reminding us that the struggle is back. And also that incentives. What Xi Jinping has done in his 10-year tenure, for example, the suppression of people's liberty in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, the militarization of South China Sea islands and islets, and all those are breaking the existing international orders, and without regard to world opinion or the competition or opposition from other major parties. And Xi felt himself he can continue with that. And also, Professor Huang is absolutely correct to say that it used to be that if Xi or the CCP can deliver on economy to give the prosperous life to the Chinese people, it can maintain its legitimacy for rule. But Chinese economy is now getting into trouble. So even that is getting into question now. So we now see a consolidation, extreme consolidation power on one man and suppressive states and control of the society at every level. So really China is becoming a larger or greater Beihan or North Korea now.
Mm. We mentioned factions, Professor Huang, and Hu Jintao was actually removed from the Great Hall reluctantly. On his way out, he touched the shoulder of Li Qiang. So in terms of factions, this, of course, was one of the factions which has been removed. What can we read into this incident?
You know, it's very tricky to figure out what exactly happened at that time. All I can say that, you know, all these events, meetings held by the Chinese Communist Party should be prearranged. It shouldn't be impromptu. So the leaving of Hu Jintao at the middle of the session should be something prearranged again. But so we have to ask, why at that timing? And why Hu Jintao seems reluctant to go? You know, Hu Jintao at the age of 79 might have had some health problem, which prevented him from, you know, sitting there for too long. But that's one of the guesses. And another guess is, of course, Hu Jintao would like to say something against Xi Jinping before the voting. So Xi Jinping and his fellows decided to remove Hu Jintao before the next session of the meeting. So I've heard a lot of, you know, possible answers to your question. But I think most importantly is that I think it shows that Xi Jinping dominated the whole party without a doubt.
Mm-hmm. Professor Sung, do you, what's your response to that?
I think the video clips you just showed, it really sends chills on your spine, isn't it? That it shows that I absolutely endorse Professor Huang just said there are several theories, but I don't think that Hu Jintao lived because of poor health, because it's very clear that he was reluctant to live. And I think it's the most believable theory is that it's a deliberate design to show the picture to the world, showing that now who is in charge and how she could do to his predecessors. And Hu Jintao's place, may I mention, that is very special. Even that Hu Jintao even facilitated she's receiving the powers. For example, who was transferring power to Xi Jinping, but he didn't like his predecessor, the Jiang Zemin, to hold on to the position of the General Secretary of the Military Commission. And he really just gave all his power to Xi Jinping. And he even facilitated the transfer of power to Xi by trying to suppressing Xi Jinping's enemies. And also, Hu Jintao should be, according to Deng Xiaoping's rule, Hu Jintao is entitled to designate Xi's successor this time. But he was deprived of this right, absolutely. So it's really a show to show the world that Xi is now totally in control, and he's a ruthless leader. He could do such a thing to his predecessor, and also the responses of all those peoples around. Nobody can say a word, which really is really very telling.
Yeah. Professor Sung, there's an old Chinese saying, which is "kill the chicken to warn the monkey." So you said that this was a message globally. No, sorry, let me bring in Professor Huang. Was this also a message, very much a message to the factions within the CCP? Was this removal a symbol and a warning to them?
If you want to see that as a warning sign to those opposing Xi, then I think, yes, you may say that. But again, you know, I think we don't know too much about that story. So of course, Xi Jinping would like to use some threatening messages or behavior to warn those people opposing him. But I think the most important is that, you can see all those people sitting on the first front almost did nothing to help Hu Jintao.
As Professor Sung said,
yes. So you can see, yes, there's something I think they should have known, and that's why, because they have known, so they didn't take any action to help Hu Jintao leave the position or leave the seat. But that's just a wild hunch.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, ahead of the 20th Chinese Communist Party Congress, I spoke with Gordon Chang, commentator and author of The Great US-China Tech War and the Coming Collapse of China. He told me Xi Jinping would continue doubling down on his policies despite their failures. Let's take a look.
So I think that we're seeing, Xi Jinping just believing that all he needs to do is do more of what he believes is right, even though just about everybody else on the planet can see that this is a great mistake. And this really is the weakness of one-man systems. And if we need any sort of affirmation of this, we can see what's happening in Russia, where Putin gets to do what he wants and he's creating one debacle after another. Well, that's China as well.
Who do you think might be the next Chinese premier?
I'm sure we're not going to see anyone who is an obvious successor. It's going to be Xi Jinping and 4 or 6 non-entities.
There are many analysts who simply say that Xi Jinping wouldn't attack Taiwan because they wouldn't want to have a war with the US. What do you believe?
We can see that Xi Jinping is implementing the largest military buildup since the Second World War, but he's also, and this is more ominous, he is mobilizing China's civilians for battle. And this means that he has a shorter time frame than most people think. This may not be just a question of Xi Jinping waking up one morning and saying, oh, now we're invading Taiwan. What could happen is we have seen these extremely dangerous intercepts in the global commons as China challenges planes and ships. And one of those could actually end up in a crisis, which could devolve into some sort of invasion of neighbors, including Taiwan. What we can say about time frame is that as China prepares and gets ready for war, we have to be prepared as well. It could be during his 3rd term, could be during his 4th term, could be any time. But the point is, when your adversary, your enemy, gets ready for battle, you do as well.
Do you believe China might use nuclear weapons or threaten to use nuclear weapons against Taiwan?
China has been threatening the use of nuclear weapons, and this has been frightening. So you go back to July of last year, China threatened to obliterate Tokyo because of its express support for Taiwan. On March 10th of this year, the Chinese military promised, quote unquote, worst consequences for countries coming to the aid of Taiwan. We have heard over the course of decades, China make threats for the first use of nuclear weapons over Taiwan and others. So we just have to take the Chinese at their word. Of course, they can be bluffing, but we can't assume that. They have a nuclear doctrine, which looks like it includes the first strike of nukes. And, a lot of people say, well, it would be very difficult for China to take Taiwan because it would involve a combined land, air, sea attack. But that assumes that China doesn't use nuclear weapons on the first day. I think that their doctrine is to use their most destructive weapons, and we have to have plans to take that into account.
That was author Gordon Chang speaking with me earlier. Now, Taiwan was added to the PRC's constitution, enshrining the opposition and containment of Taiwan independence. And at the opening of the Congress, she insisted on the acceleration of the PLA's modernization. Professor Huang, Gordon Chang says, when your enemy prepares for battle, you do too. So is all of this, all this development, is it a dramatic turn of events for Taiwan?
I think Taiwan has been quite aware the military threat of the PRC since 1949. So not only the KMT, but also the DPP governments have made every effort to deter the possible threats, military threat of the PRC. But I have to say that, yes, he's partially right, because when your enemy prepares for battle, then you should prepare for battles as well. But that is only depending on one leg to walk, and we need two legs to walk. So another leg to walk is, of course, the effective political communication between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, so that the two sides could have some opportunities to get rid of greater miscalculation or greater misunderstanding, so the risk to war could be reduced to the maximum level. And so
I think the Taiwan side is open to discourse, to diplomacy.
Taiwan side is open to discourse by saying something empathy, like we use the principles of democracy, and PRC, ROC do not belong to each other, something like that. But we need to see something more concrete, something that can be placed on the negotiating table, so that this is our Taiwan's bargaining chip to negotiate with Beijing. And Beijing's bargaining chip is clear. That is his 92 consensus and one China principle. And what Taiwan is going to offer still remains to be seen.
So what would you suggest?
So my suggestion is that, of course, we need to prepare well for our national defense. But on the other hand, I think the current government should undertake something, as I said, more concrete, according to the ROC constitution, so that at least there would be some small windows of opportunity for both sides to sit down and talk. You can see the official position of the U.S. State Department remains the same. That is, Taiwan should enhance its self-defense capability with U.S. assistance, while maintaining the possibility of meaningful dialogue with Beijing. So I think that keeping two legs to walk is the most important thing for Taiwan.
Professor Huang, let me ask you a little bit more on
Yeah.
that. So the Beijing side, I understand, is they want to have the Taiwan government to accept that Taiwan is part of China, or is that not correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so are you saying that Taiwan's government should accept that in order to have dialogue?
No, you misread me, because I never said that.
Okay, that's
and
why I'm
a lot
asking
of people
you.
misread this kind of statement I made, because I think Taiwan should negotiate with the Beijing authorities with something concrete. But that something concrete during the KMT government was the 1992 consensus. And Li Denghui's period was even one China respective.
For our international audience, let's explain what
If I can complete my
1992
sentence,
consensus
yes, Li
is.
Denghui's era was even one China respective presentation. So I think something concrete, something that might be workable to be placed on the negotiating table, that's something I would like to see, because Taiwan cannot depend only on defense. Political communication or negotiation is at least the same important for Taiwan to keep peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait.
Professor Sung, can I come to you, because do you agree with what Professor Huang says, and what is it that is more concrete that we can put on the table in order to negotiate?
I think it really depends on where is the middle ground for both sides, China and Taiwan, and whether there's something that China can ascribe to or agree to, and to promise not to invade Taiwan or resolve the situation unilaterally by force. I don't think there's any ground for that, because China's policy is really very, very clear that Taiwan has to accept unification, has to accept Chinese rule. And that's the ultimate and also a precondition for talk. And if that is not complied, and there's no channel or opportunity to talk at all, and actually the dilemma for now, it's not really on the Taiwan side's fault, because Taiwan is a democracy now. We have that for more than 30 years now. Could we say that in order to accept the so-called consensus or one China principle, that we should abandon our democratic rule? We should abandon our right to elect our president or form our government? Absolutely not. It's not possible for Taiwanese people to accept that in order to exchange some peace for that. Actually, if we think about the situation of Hong Kong, Hong Kong people said that, well, please just keep the promise to us that our high degree of autonomy under the so-called one China, one country, two system, please give us that. Please honor those promises you made back to 1984. Then what happened now? It's all being just taken away from the Hong Kongese people. So what's the price for negotiating with China? Could we say that there's any credible basis that to tell the Taiwanese people that we should try this channel to avoid war? Is that credible? Is there China could withhold his hand in Xinjiang or Hong Kong? Is China a credible case to negotiate with? No, absolutely not.
If I may add, negotiation is just one of the possible channels for our approach to peace and stability. So we cannot rely totally on negotiation with the Chinese Communists to gain peace and stability. That's one. And two, I think even the US and USSR during the Cold War, they negotiated over some arms control and disarmament deals. So, negotiations sometimes work, but you cannot rely totally on them to get what you want.
Okay. Professor Huang, Gordon Chang talks about the weakness of a one-man system, and he references Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has congratulated Xi Jinping, of course, on his third term and said the results of the party congress fully confirm your high political authority as well as the unity of the party that you lead. What lessons do you think Xi Jinping should be learning from Putin?
I think Xi Jinping's learning from Putin has been largely from the Russo-Ukrainian war. And not only the strategy, but also those political warfare conducted by Russians. And yes, Putin has made some mistakes, which will be important lessons for Xi Jinping to improve or to get rid of if Xi Jinping is going to undertake something more assertive towards Taiwan.
Would you count as one of those mistakes the actual invasion itself?
Yes, I think Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping's generals, I think, have learned a lot from these Russians' mistakes. And I think because of the preparation of the Chinese Communist Party for something important have been, well done before they are going to take some real action. So I think I'm not surprised at all if we have seen a lot of PRC researchers or officials gathered together to talk about the future plan to unify Taiwan, which is, I think, happening. They are talking about that, and that's important. But back to your one-man system question, when I was a doctoral student at Maryland, that's one of the big topics we talk about in comparative politics. Yes, one-man system is usually less satisfactory in terms of governance. But if this one man or strong man, we call it, is capable of running the country well, then maybe that one man system is better than democracies. So, for us, there's nothing absolutely right or nothing absolutely wrong in terms of governance. But in mainland China, I think we have to know that this concept of checks and balances is not there. I think in their governance, it's okay as long as we can lead the country to the right path. But of course, we can have some debates over what the right path is. So as long as I said at the beginning, economic prosperity, national defense, and China's pride on the world stage, if Xi Jinping can do the three together, then I think this one-man system will remain for a few years until Xi Jinping is willing to step down.
Professor Sung, yes. one-man system, which seems to be what we have now in China. Do you think that will create a bigger pushback from democracies?
Of course, yes. I think often I ask my Chinese friends, why do you have to tolerate this kind of leader to treat you like this? And they have no answer for me. And of course, the immediate lesson for this extreme concentration of powers on one man. It's a narrowing of this decision-making circles. So it's a narrowing of perspective, narrowing of information basis, and the tendency for those decision makers to follow the top leader's will, which is dangerous. And also for those in case of Russia and China, and when such a big country and the power is concentrated on one man, it's even more dangerous. And if you consider they are all both nuclear powers, it's very, very dangerous to the world. And the narrowing of perspective will be have a bad tendency. I think, I really hope that Putin's error has been learned by Xi. But also, I'm afraid the contrary is the case. That's what Xi Jinping has learned from Putin is that as long as you can control your domestic politics and you remove all your enemies and you base your power base domestically very solid, you can do dangerous things to the world. And even though your country will be suffer from the economic sanctions and the people will live very, very poor days. But even that, the will of the dictators still can be prevail, which is that the extreme. What is also the negative effect what we see about the extreme concentration of power on one man.
You mentioned the nuclear powers, both China and Russia. Do you think that China would contemplate using nuclear?
I think Michael Gordon just made a very, very interesting observation in the video, Gordon, about the extreme nationalist rhetoric in China threatening using nuclear powers on Japan, nuclear weapons. And also the second point is that Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons in the war of Ukraine actually had limited success in that it dissuade the European and Americans to further their aid to Ukraine or to get further involved with the Russia's Putin's war. So the lesson for Xi Jinping, I'm afraid, is the country that nuclear threat is an effective tool, if even for the U.S., not alone for Japan, which is not a nuclear power, and Taiwan, which is also not.
Mm-hmm. Professor Huang, did you agree with analysts that said that the emphasis on building up strategic deterrence for the PLA, this was in Xi Jinping's work report, that this was actually referencing nuclear capability?
Nuclear capability usually serves as the last resort to the battlefields. And I think for all those major nuclear powers, I think that's the basic military strategic principles they have been endorsing. So the strategic deterrence of the PRC, of course, includes nuclear powers, which is least likely to be used. But in terms of those conventional forces, including Air Force, Navy, and those artilleries, I think those are more formidable for those so-called foreign interventions to get involved in any risk or crisis in the Taiwan Strait. And to be more specific, the PRC now is developing some capability of deterring its enemies from the so-called first island chain. And if the PRC is able to do that or is able to enhance that kind of capability in the following years or two, then I think it would be more difficult for the US government to think of a military intervention in the crisis of the Taiwan Strait, because the US then is going to sacrifice even more to achieve its strategic goals of maintaining Taiwan as a sovereign, independent political entity, different from mainland China.
And so how is China doing that, about deterring from the first island chain?
I think they're doing something, from their perspective, quite good. For example, those supersonic missiles that can be sent all the way to the Guam, and also the PRC's Air Force, the fifth generation Air Force pilots, fighters. I think they are trying to make more and more, which is able to maintain the PLA Air Force capability of, block its enemy from the first island chain. So I think the missiles, Air Force and Navy, not to mention Navy, we always joke that the PRC Navy's building up of new vessels, just like Chinese is cooking dumplings. You know, we would put dumplings, all the dumplings into the boiled waters. So they're making new ships just like that. So I think that's why, one of the reasons why the US Pentagon or the US government in general has been very cautious of this rapid buildup of the PRC defense capabilities, because then the US advantage within the first island chain is waning.
Okay, now earlier I sat down with exiled democracy activist Wang Dan, who was one of the most prominent Tiananmen Square protesters. He told me that Chinese people are less safe than 10 years ago. Let's take a look. So Mao promised to make the Chinese revolutionaries, Deng promised to make them rich, and Xi promised to make them safe. Can Xi actually deliver on his promises if he doesn't change policy?
Well, I think the past 10 years already proved it's ridiculous to describe situation of Chinese people feel safe. For those rich people, they're already immigrating to other countries, so where's the safety? And for those ordinary people, because of COVID-19 policy, there's no safe. So I think if Xi Jinping's policy continue, there will be no so-called safe for every Chinese people.
So Xi spoke about China's need to be respected overseas, but indicated no change of policy. What do you think China must do to change its image?
Well, they have to do a lot of things. Firstly, they have to stop to use money to try to influence other countries in terms of economy, politics, and even education. Secondly, I think they have to stop so-called war diplomacy. And thirdly, they have to improve the human rights record, which lead to a lot of criticism for China. But finally, I think in a world, there's only one way to earn respect from other countries is to have democracy in China. That's the only way for China to be respected for the world.
How has Xi changed the world over the past 10 years?
Well, this is really a big question. I cannot describe in much details, but I think the main issue is after Xi Jinping took the power, he did a lot of things to try to expand China's influence and power to other countries by so-called China way. And the China way is opposite of the mainstream of international community. So China's influence become a challenge to the main value of international community. So we call it 普世价值, it's a common value. I think that's the biggest influence of past 10 years by Xi Jinping. I mean, challenge the order of liberty world.
As a Chinese, how do you characterize how Xi Jinping has changed China over the past 10 years?
I think for the past 10 years, basically he did two main things. One, in politics, he tried to defeat the development of civil society, use the power of state control, more strictly control the society. So there's no society, I could say no society at all now in China. In economy, he advocate to use government to direct the economy, which is not market economy already. So basically, in one word, I think he made China back to the 1950s.
That was democracy activist Wang Dan, who spoke to me earlier. I also spoke with Michael Sheridan, a long-time Asia correspondent with the Sunday Times in London and the author of The Gate to China, who told me that he saw the recent uptick in threats toward Taiwan resulting from risks to Xi Jinping's leadership. Let's take a look.
If you look at various periods since 1949, the risk and threat factor to Taiwan has waxed and waned according to political developments in China. We know that in the 1950s, the military confrontation was quite acute. That figured with the politics of the time. Less known is that around the transition from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao in China, there was also a sharp uptick in tension. And the Taiwan issue has always been one with which mainland politicians and factions are apt to use in their own domestic struggles. We see this again and again in authoritarian countries in recent decades, that an external cause of no immediate existential concern to the state becomes a very strong political bargaining tool among factions. I think that's the risk that certainly in recent months, I would correlate the risk to Taiwan, the risk of military action, with any risk to the existing Chinese political leadership.
Moving to the economy, perhaps a few years ago, we could say that Xi Jinping accelerated economic growth while diminishing political freedoms, but now it seems that he has choked economic growth as well. In a Times article that you wrote last year, you said that China may be the first great power that grows old before it grows rich.
The man who opened up southern China and persuaded Deng Xiaoping to allow economic reform was Xi Jinping's own father, Xi Zhongxun, who was a reformer. And although he was a dedicated communist and a Marxist-Leninist, he certainly saw the crying need for the Chinese people to be given the chance to exercise their talents and their work ethic and their educational skills to build the economy. And what Xi Zhongxun unleashed in Guangdong changed the world. Now, his son, Xi Jinping, seems to have taken the view that opening up is fine, but reform is not. And China under Xi Jinping is seeking to redraw the boundaries. We've seen that Chinese expression in Putonghua, that the state advances and the private recedes. Now, is that stifling economic growth? It's certainly changing the pattern of economic growth, but what is stifling economic growth at present is zero COVID. Make no mistake about it, there is a comparison as to why China might grow old before it grows rich, which is that zero COVID and the one-child policy are both examples of severe government control brought to bear on a problem.
That was author Michael Sheridan speaking with me earlier. Professor Sung, Michael Sheridan believes that the risk to Taiwan goes up as the risks to the Chinese leader also go up. So do you think total control by Xi Jinping, which is what we're close to now, means that the threat to Taiwan will reduce?
That is a great question, which concerns that whether Taiwan's getting safer or more dangerous after the Xi Jinping third term. I think what is very clear are those that China has been preparing for taking back Taiwan militarily, if necessary, for years. And for that, under that direction, they prepared their armies and navies, and they get their aircraft carriers, and they strengthen their military missile powers and nuclear weapons as well. So that has been going on for years. And also we've seen the military modernization and double-digit budget put into the military spending. And all those are very clear. So in a sense that Taiwan has already always been the crown, the jury on the crown for China. And if Xi Jinping wants to legitimize its rules for his future, that taking back Taiwan is the greatest prize for him. So I will say that with now we're seeing the concentration of power on Xi Jinping's hand, Taiwan is getting more dangerous, and the prospect of war is even greater. All those are irrespective of what Taiwan did. Even though Taiwan has developed its democracy, abandoned its policy to invade China, to take back China, and to cease the mobilization and cease the hostility status with China, even of all that, So it's really irrespective of what Taiwan do, that Xi Jinping is going to take back Taiwan, and he's going to do that. With this, he can concentrate on this. He could get his will done through the political machine. So I will argue that Taiwan is more dangerous.
Professor Huang, so Professor Sung there says Taiwan is more dangerous. This amassing of total control is actually in order to carry out this agenda. Do you agree with that?
I think whether or not Taiwan will be more dangerous depends on not only the cross-Taiwan Strait relations, but also on U.S. mainland China strategic competition or cooperation. So it not only takes two to tango, it takes three to dance. Okay, so it's hard to say that Taiwan will be safer or more dangerous when Xi Jinping is moving on to his third term. But I think most important is that we should try to figure out a way to get rid of war between the two sides. And you know, if the war really happens in the Taiwan Strait, and the one that suffers most will be in Taiwan. So we, of course, would like to get rid of that. And so cross-strait relations, I think, is important for the avoidance of war, but also U.S. mainland China strategic relations is also key to the peace and stability.
It's interesting the two different views that we have here. Professor Song says it doesn't matter what Taiwan does, whereas you are saying that there is a way to, yes, the cross-strait relations are very important, and US too. And let's move on to Sheridan's concept here of China could be, Professor Song, China could be the first great power to grow old before it grows rich. This is a fascinating concept.
Fascinating observations, isn't it? Yeah, and of course that's some of the factors are due to its population policies under Mao Zedong. And of course that is recently has been changed about one-child policy and about the growing old part. And also on the economic side. And so the mystery is that why we are witnessing this ruthless enforcement of zero COVID policy, irrespective of the need for economic growth, and to not to trying to hold on to the foreign investment where China was once so precious about. So I would say that it's an interlinkage between political situation and economic, and it's really decided by the people in power. When he valued continuing control and continuing the rule of the CCP and himself much more weightier than the economic growth, we will see this. And actually China has managed to irritate or getting the alert rising on not only his neighbors, but all over the world, that the rising China for many, many people in the democratic countries is not peaceful or is not good for the globe anymore. Once they believe that, but they change views dramatically in recent years. And it's all under Xi's rule. So really she's successful for doing that, to portray China as not a peaceful or the peaceful rising or a friend for the human race, which is tragic for, I think, mostly for the Chinese people, as the author just said.
Professor Huang, this idea of economic growth, which Professor Sung has talked about, that there is this shift now in China, away from economic growth, more to national security, political security. There is this, one of his philosophies, common prosperity, which was drawn into the Constitution this time round. Do you believe that this is about redistribution of wealth, that it will make Chinese richer, or is this about, cracking down on the elite, cracking down on rivals to him?
I think both, I think both will be reasonable. And if we can make Xi Jinping's common prosperity its definition or its interpretation of it in a more beautiful way, I think this common prosperity philosophy is based on not only Mao Zedong's thoughts, but also based on some sort of like Dr. Sun Yat-sen's thoughts. So common prosperity is something these political philosophers or political workers have been working on. But common prosperity, to me, also means a sort of huge social reform program, which makes those rich people think twice. What are you going to do to make concrete contribution to your great country? And this slogan will not be unpopular among this general public. And for those very rich men on the top 1% level, I think they know how to survive in such a solid party control state with this, some very uncommonly seen political slogan, common prosperity. So they know they have to contribute more financially, or they just move out of the country. But I think Xi Jinping doesn't care too much about these rich people moving out. All he needs is to make the general public think the party is taking care of us, the party is listening to us, and the party is trying to redistribute the wealth to the general public. So, at the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping said, people is our basis. I think that's what he meant.
Professor Sung, there are a few ideas there. I just want to pick up from Professor Huang that he said, in fact, and he's mentioned it a couple of times, the Chinese are actually happy. Why should they not be happy with Xi Jinping if he provides the, redistribution of wealth, economic growth?
Yeah, those
security.
ideas are beautiful and very nice. But if it's, but what really happened is, I think it's not perfectly tailored to that, because we see the advances of the state and to the disadvantage of the private sectors, which is a clear example. It's taking away properties and wealth from the people, not for the people. Of course, the CCP was once at the service of the people, 为人民服务. Of course, we know that, and it's a beautiful ideal. But what we're seeing is not that. What we're seeing is that the Chinese state is facing economic stringence situations, and it can do harm to its own people by, for example, the failing of the housing market, the failing of the private sectors, and to the advantage of state-controlled enterprises, which could be more tailored to the party's political needs. So what we're seeing is this. So it's really getting further and further from the original ideals, no matter from Sun Yat-sen or from the founding father of the People's Republic of China.
Professor Sung, what do you think about the zero COVID policy? There have been reports that the quarantine will be reduced from 10 days down to 7 days.
I hope so.
And yet there's a massive Shanghai facility being built, quarantine facility. So what's exactly going on in China?
Some commentators say that because the rationale for that is that Xi Jinping is avoiding losing face. So once he's secured his third term, those policies will ease off. Let's hope that, because that's really what the China people should need. And but we need to wait and see for that.
Professor Huang, what's your response? Do you think that zero COVID will ease off once Xi Jinping has his third term?
That's common understanding among a lot of China watchers, and I think it's a must, because China's economy has been greatly influenced by these zero COVID policies, and finally, the 20th Party Congress has come to an end, and hopefully there are not too many serious COVID confirmed cases on the mainland China. So the Xi Jinping government is more willing to ease this kind of zero tolerance policy. And so we also observe that I think the mainland Chinese authorities are making some preparations for kind of rising numbers of confirmed cases if this zero tolerance policy has been lifted, because more or less you are going to have more people got infected by the COVID, then you are going to spend more medical resources, use medical resources to take care of these people, and that will be a great deal of money instead of promoting this zero tolerance policy. So I think mainland China is thinking of those post zero tolerance policy society and the medical system, how to sustain this system so that the operation of mainland China's economy can remain effective. That's my take on that.
One of the key themes in the work report of Xi Jinping was accelerating talent in science and education. And of course, this is as a result of, or alongside, the tech war between the US and China. And this month, the US undertook some of the harshest chip export controls, Professor Sung, yet. And they, of course, they're designed to starve China, or the PLA, of AI, supercomputing. These will help the PLA to make nuclear weapons modeling, hypersonic weapons that Professor Huang has already mentioned. How long do you think these sorts of moves by the US can work? How long can the US hold back China?
That really depending on what's the details of the policy. But may I say this? This policy under Biden administration is a culmination of the long-term policies of the United States, because they find several loopholes. For example, the Chinese students stealing sensitive technologies from US labs in US universities, or the military civil conversion companies trying to steal technologies, or the Huawei more aggressive use of technology. So the US trying to impose this ban not only on cheap export, and not only on those identities on the list, but a general ban to Chinese companies and enterprises, which is new and it's a combination. And of course, the U.S. administration imposed that